Alex's sharp command pierced the noisy kitchen as he ordered, "Alara, get me some tea now." Pausing with soapy hands, I replied, "Hold on, I'm doing the dishes." His impatient tone interrupted. "Stop that and bring me the tea quickly. Can't you follow simple orders?" Mrs. Whitmore, my mother-in-law, chimed in from the living room, requesting sweet coffee while devouring cake with a malicious glint in her eyes. Looking at the towering stack of dishes, I sighed. There are so many. Leave them for later. Just do what we say, useless wife. Alex's words were like a whip, each one stinging. At 28, I was Alara, a working mom feeling trapped in a life more like a prison than a home. Married at 23, I had hoped for love and companionship, but found myself entangled with Alex and his domineering mother. My only source of joy, our 4-year-old son, was a bright spot in my otherwise bleak world. Living in Alex's parents' house was a decision forced upon me under the guise of caring for Mrs. Whitmore after my father-in-law's passing. At first, I felt sorry for her apparent grief, but it soon became evident that I was just a pawn in her cruel game of domestic control. Whether it was cooking, cleaning, or working, my efforts were never enough. Mrs. Whitmore would scorn my meals, leaving them untouched or harshly criticizing them. "The stir-fry is so half-hearted," she'd scoff. "Cook it properly from scratch." "I'm busy and can only make simple things," I'd reply, trying to keep my composure. "That's why I hate back talk from a daughter-in-law," she'd snap. "Cook from scratch. Why don't you cook then? You're a good cook, right?" I dared to retort once, instantly regretting it. "Why would I do housework when you're here?" Her response was cold and dismissive. "Are you out of your mind?" Their cruelty escalated from harsh words to a chilling silence. They began to completely ignore me, as if I were a ghost haunting my own home. My presence, once undervalued, now felt entirely invisible. 5 years passed in this suffocating atmosphere. Alex and I turned 35 and 33, respectively. Our son grew, but the oppressive air in the house remained unchanged. My 63-year-old mother-in-law seemed to feed off my unhappiness. One evening, as I dragged myself home from work, a heavy realization hit me. I felt utterly purposeless in their eyes, a shadow, unseen and unheard. The only voice acknowledging me was that of my son, and the thought of losing even that small recognition was unbearable. Upon returning home, I immediately started cooking, attempting to dispel the gloom. I prepared mapo tofu, fried chicken, and a bell pepper and pork stir-fry, hoping to inject some normalcy into our dinner. Abruptly breaking his long silence, Alex commanded, "Bring me the mayo." "Sure, here you are," I replied, handing him the mayonnaise. His first words to me in ages were not of gratitude or conversation, but a mere order. It proved to be the final straw, the breaking point of my patience and tolerance. The evening took a darker turn when Mrs. Whitmore insisted, "Clean the toilet." "What now?" I exclaimed. "Yes, now," she insisted, her voice filled with venom. Unable to contain my frustration, I snapped back, "Don't say such a thing while we're eating. It's nasty, just like your heart," she hissed. Our argument with Alex quickly escalated, and he demanded that I apologize to his mother. However, for the first time in years, I stood my ground and refused. The conflict reached its zenith, and in that moment, a decision solidified within me. I realized I needed to escape this toxic environment, not just for my sake, but for the well-being of my son. Retreating to my room, my determination strengthened. I downloaded divorce papers, filled them out, and slammed them in front of Alex. His shock was evident, but I felt nothing but a cold resolve. "I'm filing these," I declared, my voice unwavering. Facing my husband's bewildered expression, I recognized that I had finally stepped out of the shadows. It was time to reclaim my life. The days following my declaration of divorce were filled with cold glares and biting remarks. However, amidst this storm, I discovered an unfamiliar sense of liberation. One evening, as I served dinner, Mrs. Whitmore disdainfully looked at the meal. "You call this food? Even a child cooks better, she remarked. I bit my tongue, focusing on my son's smiling face. Eat up, sweetheart. I made your favorite tonight. Alex chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, playing the perfect mother now, are we? What a joke. Despite the anger simmering within me, I maintained my composure. I'm just trying to make a nice dinner for our son, I calmly replied. Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. Don't act high and mighty. You're just a burden in this house. The tension at the table thickened, and Alex's attempts to belittle me only intensified. So, Alara, have you thought about how you'll survive after the divorce? You can barely keep a house, let alone your own life, Alex challenged. I looked him squarely in the eye. I have been supporting this family for years. I'm not worried about taking care of myself and our son. Mrs. Whitmore interjected, we manage. We don't need your pity money. However, Alex's silence spoke volumes. He knew the truth. Without my income, they would be in dire straits. In the following days, their behavior became increasingly erratic. Mrs. Whitmore oscillated between sweet-talking me into staying and hurling insults when I didn't comply. Alex, on the other hand, appeared lost, his arrogant facade crumbling as the reality of his financial dependence became undeniable. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between them that sent shivers down my spine. She can't leave us like this, Alex hissed. We need her money. Mrs. Whitmore's response was cold and calculated. Don't worry. I have a plan. We'll make her life so miserable she won't dare to leave. Hearing their true intentions laid bare was a revelation. They didn't care about me or even our son. It was all about control and money. That night, as I lay in bed, a plan started to take shape in my mind. If they wanted a battle, I would give them one. However, it wouldn't be fought with words or petty arguments. I intended to hit them where it hurt the most, their pride and their wallets. The next morning, I began putting my plan into action. I reached out to a lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense woman who came highly recommended. I want a divorce, and I want to ensure they don't get a penny more than they deserve, I stated firmly. She nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. We'll make sure of that. You've been the sole breadwinner, right? We'll use that. As the days went by, my determination only strengthened. I began documenting everything, the insults, the financial manipulation, even the smallest grievances. It was time to flip the script and make them face the consequences of their actions. Building my case, a newfound sense of empowerment filled me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. The shadows of contempt were slowly lifting, and in their place, a new dawn was emerging. As the divorce proceedings kicked off, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly toxic. Yet with each passing day, my fear diminished, replaced by unwavering resolve. One evening, Mrs. Whitmore attempted a different approach. Alara, dear, why don't we forget all this nasty business? You know we're family. Her words oozed insincerity. I met her gaze without flinching. Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me, I responded. Alex, quietly observing, scoffed. Oh, playing the victim now? You're not as innocent as you pretend to be. Despite a surge of anger, I kept my voice calm. I'm not playing anything, Alex. I'm just no longer willing to be your scapegoat. The conversation shifted, as it often did, to finances. You think you can just take our son and leave? How will you support him? Alex challenged. I smiled, a small, confident curve of my lips. I've been supporting this family for years. I think I can manage. Mrs. Whitmore's expression twisted into a sneer. You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back. But their words no longer held power over me. I grasped my self-worth and embraced the truth. The following day, I met with my lawyer once more. She outlined the strategy clearly, exposed their financial dependency on you. It will be pivotal in the custody battle and asset division. I nodded, feeling a sense of validation. The law was on my side, and I was prepared to fight back. At home, the tension reached its zenith. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to undermine me grew more desperate. You think you're so smart, she spat one evening. but you're just a cold-hearted woman abandoning your family." Meeting her gaze directly, I replied, "No, I'm a woman who's finally standing up for herself." Alex interjected, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret this. You can't survive without me." However, his threats fell on deaf ears. I was done being intimidated. In the following days, my preparations for the court battle intensified. I gathered financial statements, recorded their abusive remarks, and collected evidence of their negligence. One afternoon, as I organized my documents, my son approached me. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" His voice was small and uncertain. I pulled him into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. We're leaving this place, and we're going to start a new, happy life, just you and me." His arms tightened around me, and in that moment, I knew I was making the right decision. In the following days, my preparations for the court battle intensified. I gathered financial statements, recorded their abusive remarks, and collected evidence of their negligence. One afternoon, as I organized my documents, my son approached me. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" His voice was small and uncertain. I pulled him into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. We're leaving this place, and we're going to start a new, happy life, just you and me." His arms tightened around me, and in that moment, I knew I was making the right decision. The day of the court hearing drew near, carrying with it a sense of imminent freedom. I was prepared to confront Alex and Mrs. Whitmore, determined to put an end to their control and emotional abuse. Ready to reclaim my life, I aimed to provide my son with the peace and happiness he deserved. Justice awaited, and I was resolute in ensuring it would be served. The day of the court hearing arrived, a moment I had both dreaded and anticipated. As I sat across from Alex and Mrs. Whitmore in the courtroom, a surreal feeling washed over me. This was the pivotal moment when everything would change. The proceedings commenced with a chilly formality. Alex's lawyer painted him as a devoted husband and father unjustly burdened by false accusations. Mrs. Whitmore played the role of the grieving mother-in-law mistreated by an ungrateful daughter-in-law. However, their performance was transparent, their lies fragile. When it was my turn to speak, I addressed the court clearly, my voice unwavering. "I have been the sole provider for this family for years. My husband's employment and his mother's manipulation have consistently strained our household." Alex interjected, feigning hurt in his voice. "Alara, how can you say these things? I've always supported you." Turning to him, I maintained an unyielding gaze. "Support entails more than just words, Alex. It's about actions, and your actions have shown nothing but selfishness and cruelty." The judge attentively listened as I presented my evidence. Financial statements, recordings of their verbal abuse, and testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed their behavior. The undeniable truth unfolded. As the evidence piled up, Alex's facade crumbled, and Mrs. Whitmore's composed demeanor faltered, revealing a slipping mask of innocence. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, tension thick in the air. Then came the revelation that sealed their fate. My lawyer presented photographs and documents providing evidence of Alex's infidelity and Mrs. Whitmore's clandestine affair with a wealthy neighbor, Mr. Harwood. Murmurs erupted in the courtroom as compromising images were displayed, exposing their deceit. Their true colors were revealed for all to witness. Alex's face turned pale, his eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Whitmore's expression morphed into one of fury, her hands trembling. "You invaded our privacy." Mrs. Whitmore shrieked, her voice piercing. I looked at her, my voice calm but resolute. "No, I exposed the truth. A truth that you both have concealed for too long." The judge called for order, but the damage was irreparable. Their credibility shattered, their lies laid bare in the harsh light of the courtroom. As the hearing concluded, the judge's decision was crystal clear. I was granted full custody of our son, and a fair distribution of assets was mandated. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were left with little more than their shattered reputations. Stepping out of the courtroom, I felt a burden lift from my shoulders. The years of manipulation and emotional abuse were finally behind me. I had confronted my oppressors and emerged triumphant. Yet the most gratifying moment arrived when my son rushed into my arms outside the courthouse, his face beaming with relief and happiness. "We did it, Mom!" he exclaimed, his voice resonating with joy. "Yes, we did," I replied, holding him close. "We're free now. This marks the beginning for us." As we walked away hand in hand, I recognized that this triumph wasn't just for me. It was a victory for every individual who had ever felt belittled, powerless, or undeserving. It stood for truth and justice, a new chapter unfolding, filled with hope and the promise of a brighter future. The aftermath of the court ruling was swift and chaotic. News of Alex and Mrs. Whitmore's deceit swiftly circulated, staining their reputations in our tight-knit community. They could no longer shield themselves behind a facade of respectability. In the days following the verdict, I dedicated my efforts to rebuilding my life with my son. Yet, I couldn't deny the satisfaction that came from knowing Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were facing the consequences of their actions. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, an unexpected visitor arrived. Mrs. Harwood, the wife of the wealthy neighbor involved in the affair. Her eyes were red with unshed tears. "Alara, I heard about everything. I can't believe what Sylvia, Mrs. Whitmore, did." Her voice broke, and I could see the pain etched on her face. I invited her in, offering a cup of tea. As we sat at the kitchen table, she poured out her heartache. Mrs. Whitmore's actions had caused more damage than she had ever anticipated. The next day, I encountered Alex in town. He was a mere shadow of his former self, his arrogance replaced by a defeated look. "Alara, please, can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I stopped, facing him. "What is there to talk about, Alex?" Fidgeting, he couldn't meet my eyes. "I am sorry for everything. I didn't realize how much I depended on you, on your strength." Though belated, his apology signaled a shift in power. He had lost everything: his dignity, his home, his family, and in that loss, he had finally acknowledged his own faults. However, it was Mrs. Whitmore who bore the brunt of the severe repercussions. Her involvement with Mr. Harwood not only tarnished her reputation, but also led to legal ramifications. Mrs. Harwood initiated divorce proceedings and pursued a lawsuit against her for alienation of affection. Through whispers and rumors from neighbors, I learned about Mrs. Whitmore's plight, a narrative depicting a woman undone by her own choices. She had become an outcast, rejected by those she had once considered friends. One afternoon, I spotted her at the grocery store, her eyes lowered as she hurried through the aisles. Our paths intersected, and for a moment, our eyes locked. The unmistakable look of resentment and defeat lingered in her gaze. "You did this to me," she hissed under her breath as she passed by. Observing her departure, I felt a blend of pity and vindication. "No, Sylvia, you did this to yourself," I whispered to myself. The wheels of justice had turned, and the repercussions of their actions were now inescapable. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore grappled with a life they had constructed through years of deceit and manipulation. Witnessing their struggle with the aftermath, I realized that the most potent revenge was living well, liberated from their toxic influence. Redirecting my attention to my son and our fresh start, I acknowledged that this wasn't merely a tale of revenge. It was a narrative of liberation, of breaking free from the chains of abuse and control. Looking ahead, I recognized that the best was yet to come.